A mental model of daily performance as integral, assuming fixed daily overall energy. On my Garmin watch, I have something like body battery. I could also assume I'm a processor, or I have a certain amount of processing power. Then, now this certain amount of processing power, if I split basically the time, if I split out a certain time interval, then I have a certain amount of processing power. Now this amount of processing power could be described as the integral. For this reason I in the beginning mentioned the integral. So the integral is in this case just this area which is now marked. If we now take a day as the interval that we take a look at, then we have the day which ideally has 24 hours. Now during the day we now assume that here we have intensity, mental intensity, or one could also just call it mental performance, and then here we have basically time. So this is the beginning of the day, this is the end of the day. If we now further assume that we have sleep as negative intensity and mental performance, or basically being awake and performing some demand with our task, not with our task, but with our mind, as a positive intensity, then we could set the threshold for basically when we dip below the line of awakeness as a third of the overall, basically of the overall amplitude, not of the overall amplitude, but just of the section of this y-axis. Now, why would this make sense? Because if the day has 24 hours and we sleep about 1/3 of this, 8 hours, then we would have a third of this surface area, or a third of the integral basically having to be below this graph. This could also make the point. So one could now also make the point for different sleep models, and as long as basically the area between as long as the ratio of the area of the integral between this here and this here is kind of 1/3, so this here divided by this here is 1/3, one could still say, okay, this person is at least sleeping 8 hours. Whether this is sufficient for over the long term also maybe increasing mental performance, or I don't know if this is possible, is maybe another question. So now the question is, and this is now where I introduce kind of my own experience. Over the last couple of years I tried different sleep models. I tried sleeping for 6 hours in the night. I went to bed at 11 and stood up at 5. I went to bed at midnight, stood up at 6. I went to bed at 10, stood up at 4. I went to bed at midnight, stood up at 4, and then had varying sleep, basically a varying amount of day sleep, which sometimes would last for 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours, sometimes my body would take more than the 2 hours I actually had scheduled, or the 90 minutes I had scheduled, or the 6 times 20 minutes I had scheduled, or the 10 times 10 minutes I had scheduled. What I now want to result out of this, or not result out of this, what I kind of want to conclude out of this is kind of this model here. So let's first of all assume we sleep from 0 to, let's say, 8 in the morning, because this is now very easy to draw. If we assume this, then this is 0, this is midnight, and this is 24 hours. I am well aware that some people divide the day into two 12-hour slots, but for the simplicity of this, it makes a little bit more sense like this. So we have 8 hours here. Now, if we have 8 hours here, then we sleep below this. Now we assume, just for the simplicity of this argument, that this is now kind of, that we just dip below consciousness, and then we are basically at the lowest point of mental intensity we can be in. One could call this a very regenerative state. And then once the clock hits, we basically rise out of this, we shoot out of this, and then we could now assume that the rest of the day looks like this. We spend 2/3 of our day now with the mental intensity, or with the mental performance of being awake, and we just go to the highest intensity and then again below. Now this would be maybe one model. Now one could assume multiple other things. One could, for example, assume that we could take splices out of this and basically dip during the day kind of below consciousness. Not below consciousness, but into a sleep state, which would look somewhat like this. We would then have kind of these many roads which would go below this. Now the question is, of course, whether this is actually possible. Can you kind of dip below this? Can you sleep for 1 minute? Can you sleep for 10 minutes? Can you sleep for 20 minutes? And how much of these 20 minutes you then spend in actual sleep, compared to here, where once you enter sleep, at least ideally, it goes through, similar to a washing program, and you might not want to interrupt, because then one of the washing cycles might not be as intended, or might not turn out to be or have the intended function if you just split it and then have like all of these rods going down. Now what I wanted to actually explain is what now follows. So we again have the same graph. Now if we assume again we sleep for a certain amount of the day. Now this is given. Now, in addition, the question is, and there are multiple questions like this, but the question is, if we maybe don't rise out of sleep just like this here, but maybe we rise more like this here. So this could be one of a curve. So let's say this is a 40 to 55 to 50 minute cycle. One might also argue that there are these ultradian cycles, which I have heard of, but I don't know. So there seem to be, at least during sleep, approximately these 90-minute sleep cycles one goes through. But the sleep cycle duration seems to alter itself throughout the night, at least as I understood it by reading Matthew Walker's book Why We Sleep and also having watched a few of his podcast appearances. I can't actually quite remember what I just began with. So now I just switched to this here. So the 90-minute sleep cycles, I think, are then kind of connected to the waking cycles. And there seems to be this thing where you want to optimize your day maybe for 90-minute cycles. I cut this in half, mostly for the purpose of making it also aligned with the hourly dividing or division of the day into these hours. And so I usually work for around 50 minutes or maybe 45 minutes, and then I do something else. And then I currently am experimenting with 10-minute breaks, basically, where I lie down and try to sleep. Sometimes I do dip below consciousness. Sometimes there seems to be kind of a thing that is happening, which is basically me, I think, approximating sleep. But I sometimes am still awake. I'm not lucidly dreaming, but I'm... So, yeah, doesn't matter that much now. So what I'm now trying to not analyze, but here is the following theory. What happens, or what would be the different variables whereby, so we still assume that the overall integral of this graph here, so basically the area in between wherever the line above or below is, and then between this line, is kind of has to be equaled out, or not equaled out, but the ratio has to be 1 to 3. I don't know if this does make too much sense mathematically. I just remember that the integral is kind of the area below this and also maybe below here, but maybe not. So the question now is, which variables you can control and what effect this would have. Now, one could imagine different scenarios. For example, one could imagine that by introducing something like 10-minute sleeps, one is actually now amplifying. So here is now again the idea. We have below, if we dip below consciousness, then this restores our mental performance level. And if we then go out again, there might be the case to be made that if we nap for 10 minutes, for example, that afterwards the amplitude of, so let's say this is the normal amplitude, the amplitude that we would have 2/3 of the day, if we just have it at this amplitude and then the rest. But now think about how your computer might have a backup program. The backup program can either run continuously and therefore slows down your processing power all the time, kind of like a background process, maybe also like a virus, or you have it kind of batched. In terms of us, we seem to have it batched due to the revolution of the Earth around the sun and the seasons, maybe also, with the seasons then allowing basically for an annual cycle of the circadian cycle. But what seems to be the case that we have opted for not a continuous backup or restoration in this case, not backup function, but a one that is kind of 1/3 of our day, which happens at night, where there seem to be multiple things that drive us basically towards this optimization with being sleep, this optimization. Because it's colder at night, this means that it needs to be a higher energy expenditure if we actually went and did things. Then it's also dark outside, which in terms of hunting, for example, does make it quite difficult, at least if you don't have night vision. Now, here's the idea. If I still assume that I have this like here, and I don't have any sleepover left. Not sleepover, but I don't have any sleep need left. Then, still, if I now have basically all of this mental performance up here in this area, what if I now introduce day sleeps? What if I introduce a nap here, for example? Then one could reason that now, after this, because I am taking I'm basically increasing the area below this graph, which would then make it possible maybe to also, at least for a short period of time, and because I'm additionally adding this, maybe for a short period of time I'm actually on a higher performance level. Now the question, of course, is over a given day, does this then overall increase the average performance? Is it sometimes useful to have a slightly higher performance? For example, let's say you are a musician and for 2 hours you have a concert and the rest of the day is not so important. Of course, you need to practice and so on and so forth, but maybe there are things that very much depend on this 2 hour time frame, or the 2 hour time interval. So the question is, can one optimize basically towards given time intervals during the day by taking naps and by also maybe, also there seems to be, and this seems to be something that is now not part of my theory, but rather basically part of the general sleep theory, whereby in the beginning of the day you have melatonin, so you have these two cycles. The first one is the melatonin cycle and the second one is the adenosine cycle. And these basically make up not exactly the circadian cycle, but these seem to influence when you sleep and how, and yeah, basically these are these two sleep pressure things. So adenosine, mostly sleep pressure. The longer you are awake, the tireder you get, basically, or the less awake you get. Maybe kind of the same thing. There seems to be this sleep pressure building up, which caffeine, for example, I think blocks then. So caffeine, I think, blocks the receptors for adenosine. And then you have also melatonin, and melatonin is basically dependent on outdoor light. So it is dependent on the sun. So you have these two cycles, and sometimes they align. So at least these two cycles then would align if you circadian optimize by going into the sun, like Andrew Huberman recommends on every single podcast. Now, one could also make the case that if you are more awake in the morning, then your mental performance, let's just say this is now the day and we exclude the night is somewhere here and maybe here, then if your mental performance goes down like this, let's just say it's a function like this and not linearly, it could also go down linearly, I don't know, exactly know. But of course, it would kind of make sense to maybe then do the tasks that are the most important, like here. So as a surgeon, you might want to stand up and then do the thing. But of course, also the might take a little bit to warm up. I don't exactly know. What I wanted to say with the surgeon is that the surgeon might operate in this time window. Now, similarly in other areas as well. And the question now is, how does one restore kind of functionality? And at least in my experience, it seems to be the case that if I now introduce multiple naps, and the naps, of course, now begin on this average line, which is kind of the line that separates consciousness, not so much consciousness, actually more awareness from sleep, or wakeness from sleep, is that if you introduce these rods, that actually this seems to, at least for a certain amount of time, until it dips again, basically boost my performance up, my mental performance. So if I, for example, want to make a video and I don't nap before, then eventually, after 2 hours, I begin to notice that my brain seems to become louder, kind of. Now, this could also be due to multiple other things. This could also be to maybe not including, or the brain's lack of being able to exclude basically other information that is not relevant. I don't know exactly, but it seems to be the case that there is this thing that is building up in my brain, which seems to, I don't know, depending on how much I slept and so on and so forth, and how well I slept, it seems to go up and down. But the main thing I wanted to say is, what if either by taking sleep and then distributing the sleep differently, basically throughout the day, but then of course the question becomes, what is the overall optimization in terms of sleep? And how do you basically distribute these 8 hours, if we would just assume we need 8 hours? And the second question, and of course there would be multiple more questions, the second question would be, if you can actually basically power up still this year, and therefore have the integral that is your mental performance over a given day, which needs to equal out to 1 to 3, not 1 to 3, but 1 to 2, and then sleep again is 1/3, if we assume again the 8 hours. If this actually allows you to locally now being used in a temporal manner, basically increase your mental performance, and therefore increasing, this is now actually the main theme I wanted to discuss, but I did not have this thought of the main theme previously. So if we have it like this, and we assume, okay, this is this and this is this, then overall we have this amplitude of this graph which goes from here to here. And the question now that I wanted to initially propose is, what if I sleep basically also during the day? So this would be another question, if I am able to basically go higher in mental performance does then also my sleep go lower? So basically, am I increasing the overall performance area, not performance area, but the overall mental performance availability over a given day? So basically, I'm increasing my average performance. If we just take a look at basically infinite time, we would say that my mental average performance increases if I am able to, with the integral area, so the area of overall a given day being the same, and I'm able to increase the amplitude without basically any cost to the rest of this graph, am I therefore able to increase my overall output by maybe sleeping better, so therefore making it lower? Or also, if I have a higher demand, do I then, if I would say, okay, I sleep 10 minutes after, do I actually go lower compared to if I just am not that capable because I haven't slept 10 minutes before making this video, for example? Am I therefore in the next 10-minute nap that I would schedule, am I then able to go lower, which allows me to then go higher and therefore overall optimize towards increasing my average mental ability?